Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet endurance of those who faced winters that refused to end. Stories buried beneath snow and silence of the poor who had nothing, yet somehow survived when even fire seemed to give up. Tales once brushed aside as simple folklore, or the tired exaggerations of suffering peasants, are now resurfacing, revealing how people clung to life through the harshest winters in history. The nights when frost crept into their beds, when hunger whispered louder than prayer, and when warmth itself became a kind of faith. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the frozen silence of the past, where survival was not loud or heroic, but quietly human. There was a time when winter was not a season, but a sentence. It began quietly, not with the snow, but with the light fading a little too early one afternoon. The fields froze beneath a pale sky, and the smoke from a dozen low chimneys began to linger longer than it should have. There was no warning, no announcement that warmth was leaving. It simply slipped away, and the world grew silent in its absence. The poor knew what that silence meant. It meant the long night had begun again, the months when time itself seemed to slow, when breath turned to frost and walls forgot how to hold heat. In those days, winter did not visit politely. It arrived like a weight, pressing itself against the roof, the door, the chest. A cold that crept through every seam of life, through wool and bone, through thought and sleep. There were no thick coats, no heated rooms, no glass windows to trap the warmth. Just the thin barrier of wood and faith between the living and the frozen dark. Families gathered close, not for comfort, but to become one single body of heat. You could hear them breathing together, in rhythm with the fire's tired sigh. Outside, the world moved differently. Footsteps became whispers on the frost. Streams stopped speaking, their voices sealed under ice. Even the birds, those restless souls, vanished into the whiteness. It was said that when the last crow left the village, the cold would finally settle for good. And when it came, it was not just felt, it was heard. A low, soft groan beneath the ground, as if the earth itself was trying to turn in its sleep. For the poor, there was no beginning or end to winter. It was a season that lingered in their bones all year. They worked through the summer not for leisure, but for the memory of warmth. Every stick gathered, every crumb stored, every patch mended was a quiet conversation with the cold, a plea, really, asking it to pass gently this time. But winter never listened. It simply watched, patient and unblinking, waiting for the fires to burn too low. Sometimes the nights brought a sound unlike any other, a faint tapping on the roof, not rain, not hail, but frost forming so fast it cracked the thatch. Old people said it was the sound of the cold counting souls. They believed that if you listened long enough, you could hear your name whispered among the cracks. No one ever admitted to hearing it, but everyone seemed to know someone who did, and always, it was someone who never woke again. The poorest cottages were built low to the ground, half buried, to steal what warmth the earth could offer. Inside, everything smelled of smoke, sweat, and slow decay. The air was heavy with the past. A single candle might burn for an hour, two if it was shared. Its light would flicker on faces hollowed by hunger, on fingers wrapped in cloth too thin to matter. They didn't fear the dark, they feared the stillness that came after the flame went out. That was when the cold felt alive, as if it was watching, waiting to crawl closer. Some said the cold had a memory that it remembered every person who had ever cursed it. There were stories of travellers who mocked the winter wind, only to vanish in it hours later. In the mornings, villagers sometimes found footprints leading out into the white, ending abruptly where the world turned featureless. There was no body, no sign of struggle, just silence, and the faint shimmer of frost where a human breath had once been. The elders said the cold didn't kill them, it took them back. To where, no one could say, but not every night was cruel. There were moments, small, almost invisible ones, when warmth seemed to return, if only for a breath, a shared smile near the fire, the smell of a loaf baking from the last handful of grain, the sound of a lullaby sung through cracked lips. These were their defences, not against the frost outside, but against the one forming inside them, because the poor understood something the rich never did, that warmth was not only made of fire, it was made of closeness, of endurance, of believing that spring still existed somewhere beyond the white horizon. In the deeper nights, when even the dogs had gone quiet, a strange glow sometimes drifted across the frozen fields. Faint, greenish ribbons of light that swayed like slow smoke. Few had seen them clearly, and those who did rarely spoke of it. Some said it was the souls of those who froze, rising to find a sun that never set. Others thought it was the breath of the world, escaping in the only way it knew how. The old women called it the sigh of the north. They would cross themselves softly when it appeared, and whisper, asterisk, let it pass above, not through. Asterisk. Whether superstition or truth, no one really knew, but every flicker in the sky reminded them that there was more to the cold than the wind and snow. Something ancient moved through it, something that did not sleep. When morning finally came, it was never warm. The sun was pale and far away, a mere suggestion of light. Ice traced its fingers along the edges of doors and bowls, sealing them shut. Children woke with frost in their hair, and their first breath was a ghost rising toward the ceiling. Water was a luxury. They melted snow over embers and called it tea. The day would pass quietly, each hour indistinguishable from the next. Work was slow because movement hurt. They wrapped their hands in rags and prayed the cold would spare them long enough to see another dusk. Every village had its own ways of enduring. Some built small clay pots they filled with coals and buried under straw for warmth. Others lined their walls with ashes to trap what little heat remained. A few simply trusted in company, a family of 6, sleeping side by side under one blanket, their breaths weaving into a fragile shelter. These small rituals of survival were not desperate acts, but familiar ones. Winter taught them patience, a stillness that bordered on reverence. As night returned, the horizon dimmed again into the same endless grey. Smoke curled upward, thin and resigned. Somewhere, a mother hummed softly to her child, not because it helped, but because it reminded her that warmth still existed in sound. The cold did not rage or roar. It simply was vast, patient, eternal, a teacher that demanded nothing but silence and endurance. They did not know when it would end. They never truly did. But in the rhythm of those endless winters, the poor learned a truth that history seldom remembers, that survival was not about conquering the cold, but learning to live alongside it, to let it move through their bones without breaking them, to find, within the frozen stillness, a heartbeat that refused to stop. And so, each year, they faced it again, the cold that never ended, the air that whispered their names, the frost that stole their breath but left them dreaming. And somehow, against all reason, they survived not because the world grew kinder, but because they learned to carry a small piece of warmth inside them, even when everything else had turned to ice. The poorest homes were built around a single, small fire, a quiet, breathing thing that lived at the center of every winter. It was not the great roaring blaze of the wealthy, no logs stacked high, no chimneys pulling the smoke cleanly away. It was something humbler, something always on the edge of dying. A handful of sticks, a few scraps of straw, maybe a piece of peat stolen from a nearby bog. The poor did not light their fires for comfort. They lit them for survival. The difference between life and death could be measured by how long the embers stayed alive through the night. Fire was never easy to make, and harder still to keep. In the damp corners of a thatched cottage, wood rarely dried. Smoke filled the air, thick and heavy, stinging the eyes and settling in the lungs. Yet there was no complaint. Coughing became as natural as breathing, the body's quiet protest against its only source of warmth. The poor learned to live with it, to breathe shallowly, to blink through the haze, to see beauty in the faint orange flicker that danced against the walls. The room where the fire lived was small and low, the ceiling blackened with soot, its beams glistening like the ribs of some ancient creature. The walls were rough, patched with mud, sometimes even moss, to keep out the wind. Near the hearth, everything was coated in a fine layer of ash, a soft, grey snowfall that never melted, and yet there was a kind of holiness there, for in that glow, faint and flickering, they found life itself. The fire was the heart of the house, and every spark that rose from it felt like a heartbeat. Wood was precious, more valuable than bread some days. Children were sent out at dawn to gather whatever the night had left behind, broken branches, dead roots, old shoes that could burn if nothing else would. Sometimes they found only damp twigs, heavy with frost. These would hiss and spit when thrown on the fire, filling the room with a smell somewhere between earth and smoke. No one minded. To hear the hiss meant the fire was still alive. In the villages, smoke told its own stories. The rich burned clean wood, their chimneys exhaling thin, pale plumes that disappeared into the sky. The poor burned whatever they could, and their smoke was dark and stubborn, clinging to the rooftops like a fog. From a distance, one could tell the wealth of a home by the colour of its smoke, a strange kind of map drawn not in ink but in ash. Sometimes, when the firewood ran out, people burned things that once had meaning. A broken chair, a wooden spoon, even the small carved toys of their children. There was sorrow in that act, but also gratitude. Every object was given a second purpose, to keep them alive a few hours longer. It was said that when something dear was burned, the fire burned brighter for a while, as if remembering the hands that once held it. The poor noticed such things. They believed that fire understood them, that it recognized desperation and answered it kindly. There was, however, something strange about the fire that most refused to speak of. On very cold nights, when the air outside grew too heavy to breathe, the flames would behave differently. They would rise slower, bend lower, and sometimes they would whisper. It wasn't a sound made by the wind or the crackling wood, it was softer, almost like words half spoken, half imagined. Those who listened too closely said they could hear names. Some said it was the wood remembering the forests it came from. Others said it was the dead, drawn to the warmth they once knew. No one truly knew, but everyone agreed that you must never answer it. To speak back was to invite the cold inside. There was a ritual, quiet and small, that many followed before bed. They would sit beside the fire and watch it slowly die. Not all at once, but in small, graceful steps, the flames shrinking into a red breath, the smoke curling into nothing, until only a soft glow remained. That last ember was called the sleeper. It was said that if you left one ember alive until dawn, your household would survive another night. Mothers would bend close, their faces dimly lit, and whisper a blessing to the sleeper before lying down to rest. In the morning, if the ember still glowed, they would feed it gently, never blowing too hard, for fear of angering the spirit that guarded it. The poorest among them rarely had enough wood to keep their fire burning all night, so they invented tricks, clever, quiet tricks that the rich never learned. They mixed ashes into the embers to slow their dying. They dug small pits under the hearth to trap heat. Some even buried small stones in the ashes, then wrapped them in cloth to carry into bed tiny suns hidden in rags. The warmth would fade after an hour, but that hour could mean everything. In that time, they might fall asleep before the cold found them. The smell of smoke became the smell of survival. It soaked into clothes, into hair, into dreams. Even outside, in the wind, people could tell who still had a fire at home by the faint scent that followed them. Smoke became identity proof that somewhere, in some corner of the world, your life was still burning. But fire was not always loyal. Sometimes it turned cruel. The thatch above the hearth was dry, and a spark could climb into it easily. Villages had stories of entire homes vanishing in minutes, flames consuming everything that once gave warmth. Yet no one blamed the fire. They whispered that it simply grew lonely, that it wanted to return to the sky where it was born. So they rebuilt, again and again, always leaving a small space open in the roof for the smoke to escape, a gesture of respect, a way of saying, "We understand, we won't trap you." The strange thing was how quiet the world became when the fire went out. The absence of crackle, of hiss, of warmth humming through the air. It was like losing a voice you didn't know you were listening to. In that silence, you could hear the cold move closer. It wasn't loud, it didn't rush in, it simply entered like a slow exhale and filled every corner. The poor learned to measure that silence carefully, to rise before it grew too deep. Children were told that if the fire died completely, something else would come to sit in its place. They called it the pale guest. No one had seen it, but they described it the same way, a shape without warmth, waiting quietly in the ashes until the next spark was born. Parents said this not to frighten them, but to remind them, never let the hearth go cold. Always leave something alive there, even if it's just a breath. And so, each evening, the poor tended their small, stubborn fires with the devotion others gave to prayer. They fed it not just wood, but hope a braver, hope that the morning would find them still here, still breathing, still warm enough to keep trying. Every spark was a promise, every glow a memory of summer. The fire did not judge their poverty, nor demand offerings grander than a twig or two. It asked only to be remembered, to be kept alive just as they asked of the world itself. When the wind howled through the cracks and the snow pressed against the walls, they would turn their faces toward the ember's light and whisper softly, "Stay." It was not a command, but a plea, given to the only thing that still understood them. And sometimes, in that dim glow, they could almost imagine the fire listening, breathing with them, keeping time with their hearts. The night would pass. The cold would wait outside, and in the small, smoke-filled rooms of the forgotten, life would continue faintly, tenderly, against all reason by the fires that refused to die. There was a certain silence to cold nights that no fire could fully chase away, a kind of stillness that pressed down on the world, heavy and slow. For the poor, warmth did not come from what they had, but from what they could make. And when they could make nothing new, they learned to make do. Blankets were a luxury, and so they wove warmth out of whatever life left behind, the forgotten, the broken, the strange. It was never about comfort, it was about endurance, about keeping the breath inside the body just long enough for another dawn to come. A true blanket, one woven from good wool, was a thing of dreams. The poor rarely saw such things except in the hands of travellers or in the windows of the wealthy. Their own coverings were something else entirely, layers of whatever could trap air, hold heat, or soften the ache of the ground. Old clothes stitched together, sacking from grain, even dried grasses pressed between cloth. Each layer carried a faint smell of where it had been, the earth, the animals, the smoke from the hearth. But, together, it formed a kind of fragile armour against the night. In some places, people slept under rugs meant for the floor, their edges frayed and stiff from years of walking. In others, families used worn sails from fishing boats, The salt crusted deep into the fibres. When it rained, the smell of the sea returned to their rooms, and for a moment, they could almost pretend they lived by the shore again. In the poorest homes, blankets were sometimes made from scraps of paper or thin bark, layered and wrapped in rags. It was not soft, but it kept the wind from touching the skin, and that was enough. The strange thing was how creative poverty made them. Nothing was ever truly useless. When clothes tore, the fabric was cut into strips, then braided together to make something thicker. Mothers taught their children to patch not with care for beauty, but for survival, every stitch a small act of defiance against the cold. There were quilts that looked like maps, lines of fabric crossing like roads, each piece telling its own quiet story. A father's coat, a child's sleeve, a curtain that once hung in a neighbour's house before it too froze. Some of the poorest found warmth in the strangest of ways. In the countryside, hay and straw were stuffed into sacks to create makeshift mattresses. When the body lay on them, the heat from within would rise and spread slowly through the dry stalks. But hay had its own life, small insects that refused to die even in the cold. People would sometimes feel them moving under their backs, tiny reminders that warmth was never without cost, yet they said nothing. It was better to share your bed with the living than the cold. In the cities, where even straw was scarce, rags became currency. There were rag pickers who went from house to house, collecting what others threw away. A single large piece of fabric, no matter how torn, could mean survival for someone else. The poor bartered for them, traded bits of bread, or simply stole them from the drying lines at night. The world judged them, but the cold did not. The cold had no morality, only hunger. Sometimes they found comfort in animals, not out of affection, but out of need. Dogs, cats, goats, even chickens all shared the same sleeping space. The warmth of a body, however small, was precious. In some regions, people dug shallow pits in the floor, filled them with straw, and slept curled together like nesting creatures. In the dimness, all breathing blended into one steady rhythm, a kind of soft music that carried them through the dark hours. There was no shame in this closeness. It was simply how one survived. But there was something oddly mystical about the blankets themselves. People began to believe that certain fabrics remembered warmth, that the longer something had been worn or held close, the more life it retained. Old coats passed down through generations were said to keep their owners warmer than any new cloth could. It wasn't superstition, exactly. It was faith in the unseen, in the quiet echo of human touch. A blanket wasn't just fabric, it was memory woven into material, a collection of nights survived and mornings endured. On the harshest nights, when frost crawled across the floorboards like a living thing, people did not always sleep. They would sit wrapped in their patchwork layers, whispering to each other to stay awake. To fall asleep too soon, too deeply, could mean never waking again. Children were told to move their fingers and toes under the blankets to keep the blood flowing. And in that stillness, they would sometimes tell stories not of heroes or wars, but of warmth. Tales of mythical fires that never went out, or of old saints who carried blankets that could heal frostbite with a single touch. In some northern villages, there was a peculiar belief that if you wrapped yourself in too many layers, the cold would become angry. They said the frost was jealous that it would find any weakness, any gap, and slip inside. So, people learned to balance their coverings carefully, leaving just enough air between layers for the warmth to breathe. Too tight, and you suffocated your own heat. Too loose, and the cold would steal it. There was an art to it, a science of survival born from centuries of watching the cold win. Some households had one blanket for the entire family. It would be spread across everyone at once, from the eldest to the youngest. At night, they moved as one, careful not to pull too much toward themselves. Children learned early to sleep still, to share warmth without words. and when morning came, the blanket was folded carefully, never tossed aside. It was treated like a living thing, fragile, temperamental, essential. If it tore, it was mended immediately, even before breakfast. A tear in the blanket was like a wound in the family. There was also a curious tradition in parts of Europe when a person died in winter. Their blanket was never buried with them. It was believed that the warmth it had gathered from their life still lingered, and to bury it was to waste it. The blanket would be given to another, passed on quietly, with no words spoken. Those who slept beneath it said they sometimes felt a strange calm, as if someone else's dreams had stayed behind, not haunting, but gentle, a shared warmth between the living and the dead. In the absence of real blankets, some used words instead, soft murmurs before sleep prayers, lullabies, even fragments of songs that had long lost their melodies. Sound, after all, carried its own kind of warmth. It filled the cold space between bodies, wove invisible threads from one person to another, and when the wind howled too loudly outside, those whispers grew stronger, like an unseen blanket wrapped around the entire house. It's easy, now, to take warmth for granted, to press a button, to draw a blanket from a shelf and call it comfort. But for them, it was sacred. Every thread, every patch, every scrap of cloth carried a history of endurance. They slept not in luxury, but in persistence. Beneath layers of worn fabric, they dreamed of summer fields, of sunlit rooms, of the day when the cold would finally loosen its hold. Even now, when old blankets are found in attics or sealed trunks, their weight feels different. They smell of smoke, of earth, of long-forgotten nights where people huddled close, whispering through the dark. If you were to hold one to your cheek, you might still feel the faintest trace of warmth, not from the fabric itself, but from the memory of hands that once clung to it. That is how the poor survived the harshest winters, not with what they had, but with what they refused to let go of. Hunger has a sound in winter. It is not loud or sudden. It begins as a soft emptiness, a quiet ache that grows deeper as the cold deepens. For the poor, winter was never just about the frost on the windows or the smoke that refused to rise. It was about the stillness inside the stomach, the hollow place that echoed louder than the wind. They learned early that warmth meant nothing without food. Fire could chase away the cold, but hunger was a different kind of frost, one that began within and spread outward, slow and relentless. When the nights grew longest, meals became smaller. Bread turned thin, stew turned clear. The first thing to vanish was flavor, then satisfaction, then comfort. Eating became a ritual, not a pleasure. A single crust shared among many. A bowl passed carefully so that every mouth would taste, even if only once. The poor never spoke much while eating. Words wasted breath, and breath wasted strength. Silence sat beside them at every meal, as constant as the cold. The poorest families learned to stretch food beyond what seemed possible. A single turnip might last 3 days. A handful of grain turned into a pot of thin porridge. They learned to boil everything twice, then once more, until the water itself tasted faintly of nourishment. Even the ashes of burned bread were saved, mixed with snow, stirred into a grey paste, eaten slowly to trick the body into believing it had been fed. It was not survival through strength, but through patience. In villages buried deep in snow, people turned to what little the earth would still give. Roots frozen in the ground were dug up with numb hands. Sometimes they found nothing but stones, but sometimes a carrot, a thin onion, something small and miraculous. There were stories of people who boiled bark from trees, scraping it down to thin strips and calling it soup. It had no taste, no scent, but when swallowed, it felt warm for a moment. And that moment was worth everything. The strange part was how the mind began to change when the hunger stayed too long. People began to dream differently. They spoke of food as if it were alive, bread that breathed, apples that whispered their names in sleep. In the flicker of dying fires, some swore they saw the shape of a loaf rise in the embers, as if teasing them from the other side of warmth. Children, too weak to play, would sometimes chew on their own sleeves, the fabric damp with hope, and through it all, no one screamed, no one raged. They endured hunger the same way they endured cold, quietly, reverently, as though it were a sacred visitor they had to host. Some of the old believed hunger had a spirit. It moved from house to house, they said, choosing where to linger. To drive it away too harshly was dangerous hunger. Once angered, could return with vengeance. So they treated it gently. When the last bit of bread was gone, they would still leave a crumb on the windowsill, a silent offering to the spirit that watched. It was a way of saying, "We respect you, but pass us by tonight." Whether superstition or survival, it gave meaning to the emptiness. In some parts of the world, people relied on snow itself. They melted it to fill their stomachs, pretending it was something more. But snow has a cruel nature. It cools the body even as it soothes the thirst. Many froze that way, chasing false fullness, until the shivers grew still. There were mothers who melted snow for their children, stirring it as though cooking, whispering that soup was coming soon. The illusion alone was sometimes enough to keep a child quiet until sleep took them. And sometimes sleep was mercy. Hunger reshaped time. Days no longer followed the sun, but the stomach. Morning meant the hope of something to eat. Night meant the disappointment of nothing left. In the deepest winters, there were no seasons of plenty, only degrees of starvation. The poor learned to read their own hunger like a clock, the slow rise and fall of weakness, the dizzy calm that came before fainting. There was even a strange peace in it, a stillness of the body learning how little it truly needed to keep going. Neighbours helped when they could, but charity too has limits in the cold. A family barely surviving could not feed another. Still, there were quiet exchanges, a few grains here, a spoonful there. It was never enough, but it was something. In some villages, there existed a strange kind of communal stew. Everyone contributed whatever they had, a root, a bone, a handful of oats, and the pot stayed on the fire day and night. When one family was starving, they could take a ladle of the broth and add their own scraps later when fortune turned. It was not about fairness, but faith, the belief that warmth shared, however thin, might circle back one day. But hunger had darker sides too. People told stories of the hollow nights, when the mind began to wander, and shadows on the walls looked like food. Some said hunger made you see ghosts not of the dead, but of the meals you'd lost. A loaf of bread would appear on the table in dreams, glowing faintly like a candle. You'd reach for it, but your hands would pass through. Then you'd wake to the sound of the wind and realize your fingers were cold around nothing. In some places, they called it the hunger light, a small flicker that followed you through the night, whispering what you craved most. And yet, somehow, they survived. They learned to find warmth in small things. The smell of something cooking in a neighbour's hut, the faint crackle of wood catching fire, even the act of waiting itself. Hunger taught them attention to notice every scent, every sound, every flicker of life that promised sustenance. They could tell from miles away when someone was baking. The air would change, carrying the faint sweetness of smoke and flour. For a few moments, they'd close their eyes and let the smell feed them. There were rare miracles too. Stories of someone finding a cache of old grain beneath a floorboard, or of a stray animal wandering into the village and becoming a feast. People remembered such moments for decades. They spoke of them in hushed tones, not as luck, but as gifts from something beyond the frost. These stories gave them something to hold on to, proof that even in the hungriest of winters, something unseen was still watching over them. By the time spring returned, those who had survived no longer ate quickly. Their bodies had forgotten abundance. The first meal after famine was taken slowly, almost reverently. Bread was not chewed but savoured, held in the mouth like a secret. They said that after true hunger, food began to taste different, not just in flavour, but in memory. Every bite carried the ghost of an empty night. Every crumb felt sacred. And yet, the memory of hunger never left. It followed them into the warmer months, into their dreams, into their bones. Even when their bellies were full, they still stored bits of food away, just in case. They kept crusts under pillows, dried roots in corners. They could not forget the quiet ache of the frozen nights, the sound of their own stomachs, whispering beneath the wind. Perhaps that was the strangest part of all, how hunger changed not only the body, but the soul. It made them cautious, humble, and oddly tender, for in the stillness of those long winters, they learned that hunger, like the cold, could be survived but never forgotten. It lingered long after the snow had melted, in the way they shared a meal, in the silence before the first bite, in the eyes of those who still remembered what it meant to be empty and alive. In the long stretch of winter, when hunger and cold pressed against every wall, the poor became quiet inventors. Necessity turned their hands into craftsmen, their minds into slow-burning fires that shaped the impossible into the barely livable. These inventions were not grand or celebrated. They did not shine in palaces or echo in history books, but they were the quiet miracles that kept people breathing when the world itself seemed frozen in stillness. Survival, for them, was not a single act of courage. It was a collection of small, ingenious gestures performed in silence. There were those who learned to make light from nothing. When candles ran out and oil was too dear to buy, they began to burn twisted ropes, soaked in animal fat, or the ends of rags dipped in old grease. The smell was heavy, the flame uncertain, but it was light enough to see a face, a bowl, a page. Some said that if you stared into such a flame long enough, you could hear faint crackles like whispers, as though the fire itself was remembering the animals it came from. No one found it strange. In winter, everything seemed to whisper, especially the things that kept you alive. For warmth, people built what they called sleep stones. They would heat smooth river stones in the fire until they glowed faintly, then wrap them in cloth and slip them beneath their bedding. The stones would sigh out warmth through the night, cooling slowly beside their bodies. But there was always something eerie about them, the way they felt almost alive, like quiet companions who shared the night's breath. Some believed the stones absorbed dreams, that they could take a piece of your fear and return it as calm. In certain places, the same stone was used by generations, each winter carrying the memory of those who had slept before. Others turned to sound. They found that certain noises could make the cold feel less sharp, the soft rattle of dried beans in a pouch, or the steady rhythm of a wooden spoon stirring an empty pot. These were not songs, but sounds that filled the silence, a kind of lullaby for the frost. Even in starvation they stirred the pot as if it mattered. The motion alone brought comfort. The poor understood that the body believed what the hands repeated, that the act of stirring could almost summon warmth, even when there was nothing left to cook. In the countryside, people found clever ways to trap warmth inside their walls. They mixed mud with straw, ashes, and animal hair, spreading it thick on the inside of their cottages. When it dried, it sealed out the wind, and when the hearth burned, the smoke would cling to it, darkening it to a rich brown. The walls would smell of fire for years, and when you leaned against them, they held a faint heat, as if the house itself remembered the warmth it once contained. No one thought of it as invention. It was simply what had to be done, small quiet wisdom passed from mother to child, from neighbour to neighbour, like secrets too simple to forget. Then there were the windows, or rather, the absence of them. Glass was for the wealthy, The poor learned to make their own version, sealing the openings with thin animal skins, waxed paper, or layers of oiled cloth. In the light of day, the material glowed a soft amber, turning the outside world into a hazy dream. When the wind blew, the fabric trembled slightly, and it almost seemed to breathe. From within those dim rooms, the world looked softer, quieter, and perhaps that was a mercy. There was also a strange practice among some of the old women. They would hang spoons and bits of metal near the hearth, just above where the warm air rose. The clinking, they said, kept the frost spirits away. If the spoons stayed still, it meant the air had grown too cold and someone must tend the fire. If they moved gently, it meant the warmth still lived. Whether they truly believed it or not didn't matter. The sound was comforting, and in a world where everything froze, even a faint jingle of life was enough to make people smile. Food, too, brought invention. When there was nothing left to eat, they found ways to trick hunger into quietness. Some filled their stomachs with boiled leather, softened until it became chewable. Others made bread from crushed bark, mixing it with snow and salt. There was even a tale of a village that learned to grind old bones into powder and bake it into thin cakes, brittle, white, and tasteless, but sustaining enough to last another day. The poor did not see these things as grotesque. They saw them as proof that life was stubborn, that it would find a way, even through dust and frost. The cold changed the very rhythm of life. People began to move slower, to breathe shallower, to save their strength in invisible ways. They learned to read the air, to know when to open a door, when to stay still, when to move toward the light. Every act was deliberate. Even silence became a skill. The less you spoke, the less heat escaped from your lips. In this quiet discipline, there was a strange peace, a kind of understanding between the body and the world. The poor became like winter itself, patient, minimal, enduring. There was one invention that few spoke of openly, though nearly all practiced it. It was called the trading of warmth. Families would take turns lying beside the weakest a child, an elder, someone ill, and share their heat directly, skin to skin, beneath the blankets. They rotated through the night so that no one grew too cold or too warm. It was not an act of love, though love often followed. It was simply a system, like breathing together. But those who survived such winters said that years later, they could still recall the feeling of another heartbeat against theirs, slow and steady in the dark, a memory of shared endurance more intimate than words. The mind, too, became inventive. To distract from hunger or fear, people began to count the cracks in their ceilings, the drips of melted frost along the wall, the creaks in the roof that came at regular intervals. It was a kind of rhythm, almost like prayer. Some imagined that the cracks were roads, the frost was rivers, and that they were travelers moving through a quiet world of ice. These small fantasies kept them from despair, and in a strange way, created worlds within worlds, soft, dreamlike refuges built entirely inside the mind. Every invention, no matter how simple, carried a quiet beauty. A pot patched with wire, a shoe stuffed with moss, a cloak lined with pages torn from an old book. People wore words against their skin, forgotten prayers, laws, love letters, as though meaning itself could keep them warm. And maybe it did. There is something deeply human in the belief that stories and warmth are somehow connected. The poor never called themselves inventors. They had no names for what they made, no patents or claims. Their tools were patience and observation. Their reward was another sunrise. And yet, looking back, these small acts of survival were as wondrous as any invention of empire. They built not machines, but methods of endurance. They created warmth where none should exist. They made silence livable. And through it all, they never stopped imagining. Even in the dimmest rooms, a kind of creativity glowed faintly, like the coals at the bottom of an old fire. They may have had nothing, no comfort, no certainty, but they possessed an understanding that still feels profound today, that life, when cornered, becomes endlessly resourceful. It learns to speak softly to the cold, to make friends with the darkness, to find fire in the smallest things. When you think of winter now, the hum of a radiator, the soft light of a candle, the warmth of a thick blanket, remember that much of it began there, in those quiet huts, among the forgotten poor. Every comfort we hold came from someone's attempt not to die of the cold. Every spark of invention began as a whisper in the dark, a hand reaching toward the faint glow of survival and deciding, somehow, to hold on. There comes a point in every winter when time itself seems to stop moving. The sky no longer changes, the days no longer pass, and the people, bound by the rhythm of cold, begin to live in slow motion. It was in this stillness that faith began to take on its frozen form, quiet, patient, and deeply personal. Not the kind of faith spoken of loudly in temples or shouted from pulpits, but the kind that whispered beneath blankets and inside empty stomachs. It was the faith of waiting, waiting for warmth, waiting for light, waiting for something unseen to stir the silence of the world again. The poor, who had nothing left to trade or eat, turned their eyes toward the unseen patterns of the season. They watched the frost gather at their windows each morning and read it like scripture. Some believed that if the frost formed in long lines, spring would come early. If it came in circles, the cold would linger. These were not prophecies but small comforts, a way of giving shape to the unanswerable. When you cannot control the cold, you begin to look for meaning in its movements. The frost became their calendar, their teacher, their quiet sign that the earth was still alive beneath the ice. In villages where no priest came anymore, people made their own rituals. A pot of water left by the door each night, to see if it would freeze, or not, a way of measuring how close life was to returning. A candle lit before sleeping, not as a prayer to any god in particular, but as a conversation with the dark itself. Some spoke to their dead, believing that the cold carried their voices further. In the early mornings, when mist rose from the roofs like breath, it was said that the ancestors were exhaling too, watching, waiting, keeping company with the living until the thaw came. No one questioned it. In such a long winter, it was comforting to imagine that something unseen waited with you. There was a strange belief, passed quietly among the old, that faith itself could freeze. They said that, in deep cold, even prayers slowed down, words hung in the air like mist, trapped until spring released them. That was why some people prayed silently in winter, mouthing their hopes without sound, so that their wishes would not be caught in the ice. When the first thaw came, they would speak aloud again, trusting that the world could finally hear. It was not superstition, really just a poetic way of describing what the cold did to the heart. When everything froze, even belief seemed to move slower, denser, like honey stiffening in a jar. Still, there were those who refused to stop believing in the turning of the season. Every day, they marked a small line on the wall, a tally of survival. The marks looked like the ribs of some ancient creature, carved faintly into stone. To an outsider, they meant nothing. But to those who made them, they were proof that time, however faintly, was still flowing. Counting the days was another form of faith. It said, "We are still here. The sun has not forgotten us." In the fields, beneath the snow, seeds waited too. The people knew this, though they could not see them. They told stories about how the earth itself slept not dead, only dreaming. They said that every root beneath the frozen soil hummed softly, like a sleeping animal. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear it, a low vibration in the stillness, a sound like breathing coming from the ground. Whether that was imagination or something real, no one dared to say. But it made the waiting easier. It gave the silence a heartbeat. The waiting season, as they called it, was not just a time of endurance, but of strange reflection. With nothing to do and nowhere to go, people began to notice small things they had never seen before. The slow melt of ice along a window frame, the way breath fogged and disappeared, the faint hum of the world beneath the snow. Even boredom took on a sacred weight. To wait without despair became an act of quiet bravery. There was beauty in doing nothing, in simply existing long enough to see the first drop of water fall from a thawing roof. Children, who could not yet understand patience, invented their own rituals for hope. They would press their faces against the window and whisper to the frost as if it could hear them. Some drew shapes in the mist suns, birds, rivers, tiny promises of movement. And sometimes, by morning, the frost would return in new patterns, echoing their drawings faintly. It was probably coincidence, but in a world ruled by stillness, even coincidence felt divine. Not all faith was gentle. Some began to question whether spring would ever come again. They would look at the endless grey of the sky and feel that the sun had abandoned them. It was said that in every long winter, there were always a few who stopped believing not in God, but in the thaw itself. They stopped tending the fire, stopped checking the sky, stopped marking the days. Yet strangely, even they were part of the rhythm. Their surrender became a shadow that made the endurance of others shine a little more quietly. Hope, after all, is only visible when it is nearly gone. There was one curious practice that emerged during these waiting months, a kind of listening ceremony. Late at night, when the world was utterly still, families would sit together and listen to the sound of the ice. Roofs, beams, and frozen trees all made small cracking noises as they expanded and contracted in the cold. Each sound was given a meaning. A soft crack meant the frost was deepening. A sharp snap meant the air was shifting. Some believed that if you listened carefully enough, you could hear the exact moment when winter began to loosen its grip. It was like listening to the slow breath of something sleeping, the sound of the world dreaming of warmth. Faith, in this season, was not about grand revelations. It was about repetition, tending the same small fire, sweeping the same floor, lighting the same candle even when nothing changed. There was a quiet kind of holiness in doing things simply because they needed to be done. The poor did not ask for miracles. They only asked that the cycle of the world continue, that the frozen faith in their chests would one day thaw into motion again. Every bowl of thin soup, every patch sewn into a torn coat, was an unspoken prayer. When spring finally came, and it always did, though never when expected, the thaw was almost unrecognizable at first. The first signs were not flowers or sunshine, but the sound of dripping water, the faint scent of damp earth. For days no one celebrated. People watched cautiously, afraid the warmth might vanish again. Then, one morning, a bird sang. It was a small, uneven sound, almost lost in the wind, but those who heard it said it felt like the world had remembered its own voice. The frost began to retreat from the windows, the snow from the roofs. The long waiting was over, though no one could quite say when it had ended. In the weeks that followed, many said that the thaw felt quieter than before, as though winter had left something behind in them, a softness or a slowness that stayed long after the cold was gone. The silence they had lived through had changed the way they listened, the way they prayed, the way they moved through the world. They no longer needed to rush or shout. They had learned to trust in things unseen, in cycles that worked beyond their understanding. And even years later, when the frost returned again, they faced it differently. They no longer feared the stillness. They understood that winter was not an enemy, but a teacher, that waiting could be a form of strength, and silence could be its own kind of faith. Somewhere beneath the frozen fields, the old seeds of patience would always be sleeping, waiting to rise again with the first light of spring. And so the poor, wrapped in their worn blankets, would whisper the same quiet promise each year, not to gods or saints, but to the season itself. Asterisk. You will pass. You always do. Asterisk. When winter tightened its hold, and the nights seemed endless, the streets themselves began to change. They stopped being roads and became echoes, frozen pathways where even sound seemed to travel differently. If you walked through an old city in the heart of January, before dawn, you might have noticed it too, how every footstep carried for longer than it should, how a whisper seemed to slide across the ice and vanish into corners where no one stood. In the poorest quarters, where cobblestones were cracked and half buried beneath snow, the sound of the world seemed thinner, as though the air itself were listening. The poor, wrapped in rags and silence, learned to move through these frozen streets with a strange kind of reverence, careful not to wake the quiet. In those days, sound was something precious. The clatter of a horse's hooves on ice, the creak of wooden wheels, the faint rattle of a cart, each noise told a story. A merchant on his way to the morning market, a beggar dragging his worn shoes through the frost, a child's muffled laugh echoing off stone walls. In warmth, these sounds would blend into the background of life. But in the cold, when everything slowed, every sound stood, alone, distinct and hollow, like an old bell struck in an empty church. Some said that you could tell how poor a street was by the kind of silence it made. Rich streets hummed with carriages and clinking windows, but the streets of the poor simply breathed in and out, quiet and patient, waiting for morning. The sound of freezing was, in its own way, alive. Water that had gathered in the cracks of stone would expand overnight, splitting the pavement with a faint sigh. Icicles would form along the eaves of roofs, dripping rhythmically as the sun touched them, like the measured ticking of an ancient clock. Those who lived close to the ground, the beggars, the street children, the night workers, came to recognize these tiny hidden symphonies. The world spoke to them not in words, but in small crystalline sounds. The crunch of boots over packed snow, the soft tearing noise when someone peeled a blanket of frost from a window, the sharp crack of a board breaking under its own weight. For those who had nothing else, these sounds were company. There was a strange phenomenon people sometimes mentioned in hushed tones, something they called times the hum beneath the frost. Asterisk. It was said that on certain nights, when the cold was deepest and the streets were utterly still, you could hear a faint humming sound rising from the ground. It wasn't the wind, nor the movement of pipes or water. Some claimed it was the city itself, its stones shrinking and expanding with the cold, sighing through the frozen earth. Others believed it was something older, something that lived beneath, a pulse of the land remembering all the feet that had walked upon it. Children, with their boundless imagination, said it was the ghosts of those who had frozen there long ago, humming softly so the living wouldn't feel so alone. No one could prove it, but when the nights grew silent enough, even the skeptics admitted they had heard something. For those who wandered the streets at night, guards, watchmen, and the sleepless, the frozen world was full of tiny miracles. The moonlight would turn every piece of ice into a mirror, reflecting faces and roofs in miniature. Sometimes, the snow itself made noises, faint pops and sighs as it settled under its own weight. These were small, almost imperceptible details, but in a world where nothing moved quickly, they were enough to keep one's mind occupied. Even exhaustion had a sound, the quiet exhale of someone too cold to speak, the distant cough of a man trying to keep warm under a broken archway. The poor didn't just survive winter, they listened to it. In some places, particularly in the narrow alleys of northern towns, the cold changed the way voices behaved. Words bounced back from the walls differently, sharper and slower, A person could whisper in one corner and hear their own words return seconds later, thinner, colder, distorted slightly, as if spoken by someone else. This strange echo fascinated those who worked late bakers, rising before dawn, night watchmen, stray musicians. They would sometimes test it, whispering secrets or names into the air just to see if the walls would answer. It became a small superstition that if you heard your own voice return to you clearly, winter would soon end. But if the echo broke or vanished entirely, it meant the frost would linger. Many of the poor made their homes near these frozen streets under bridges, in doorways, beside silent canals. They became part of the city's nocturnal rhythm, the sound of a hand striking flint, the wheeze of breath trying to start a fire, the slow rub of fabric against stone. All of it was part of the landscape. Sometimes, at night, you could hear laughter too, thin and tired but still real. Even in the coldest corners, people found ways to create warmth from sound, a tune hummed softly, a prayer spoken into empty space, a whispered story to no one in particular. Words were fragile things, but in the stillness of winter, they seemed to last longer, hanging in the frozen air like faint smoke. The markets, when they finally opened at dawn, were filled with a different kind of sound. The scraping of shovels clearing snow, the slow creak of wooden stalls, the thud of loaves being stacked one by one. Horses exhaled great clouds of steam, and their harnesses jingled with dull frozen bells. It was a symphony of survival, unhurried and rhythmic. Those who came to sell or beg wrapped their voices in layers of cloth, calling out in hoarse whispers. The city woke slowly, as though afraid to break the silence it had nurtured all night, and beneath it all, that low hum remained, the sound of frozen streets dreaming under the weight of another morning. There was one winter, so cold that even metal began to sing. Gates, fences and door hinges would vibrate softly when the wind moved through them, creating a ghostly music that drifted down alleys like the echo of distant bells. People said the city was speaking not with words but with tone. Some found it eerie, others found it comforting, as though the buildings themselves were humming lullabies for those still awake. Children would press their ears to frozen pipes just to listen, claiming they could hear melodies. Of course, no one else did. But it became a quiet pastime in those harsh months to listen and imagine that the cold had a voice. When snow finally began to melt, the city's sound changed again. The silence loosened, drips became trickles, trickles became running water, and the air filled with tiny clicks and murmurs. The poor noticed it first. They said that the city sighed when the thaw came, like someone releasing a long-held breath. It was the sound of return carts rumbling again, doors opening, footsteps quickening. But those who had lived through the long freeze never forgot the quiet that came before. They carried it with them, that memory of stillness, of nights when the streets spoke, softly, and the cold itself seemed alive. Even long after the snow was gone, they would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced they could still hear it, the faint crunch of frozen footsteps, the whisper of frost shifting along stone, the echo of their own breath on a winter street. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps it was the city remembering them in return. In the end, no one could say for certain, but the poor, who had learned to survive by listening, understood one thing deeply, that silence too is a sound, and in winter it was the only one that never truly went away. It seems strange to speak of kindness when describing the cold. The poor, who felt its sharpness most, might not have used that word at all, and yet, as years passed and memories softened, many came to see the winter not only as an enemy, but as something quieter, a patient teacher, or even a companion. For those who had nothing, the cold revealed things no summer could. It stripped away all that was unnecessary, leaving only the bare shape of life, hunger, breath, warmth. and silence. In its stillness, there was a peculiar honesty. Nothing pretended to be more than it was. Everything that survived did so simply and completely. There was a strange kind of fairness in the cold. It touched the rich and the poor alike, the high towers and the low huts. Of course, the poor suffered more, yet there was a comfort in knowing that the frost did not discriminate. Even the grandest mansions creaked in the night. Their windows rhymed with the same pale frost that gathered on the cottages. In this sense, winter was the great equalizer. The cold didn't care about wealth or bloodlines. It entered through any crack, ignored every title, and humbled even those who thought themselves untouchable. In the quiet of the season, the world seemed balanced again, if only for a moment. Among the poor, there was a peculiar saying, "Times the cold remembers what people forget." Asterisk. They meant that the frost had a strange way of keeping things honest. In summer, a man might pretend he was something greater than his hunger, but in winter, the truth returned. The body could not lie when the cold entered it. The shivering, the shared fires, the borrowed coats, all of it stripped away pride and pretense. In a way, the poor saw kindness in that. The cold reminded them that everyone was made of the same fragile material, no matter how fine the fabric that covered it. There was also another, quieter form of kindness that came with the cold, the kind that people showed one another. In the hardest winters, when the snow piled higher than the windowsills, and even bread turned stiff as stone, the poor would share what little warmth they had. A man with a half-broken stove would invite his neighbour in to sit beside it. A mother with one blanket would tuck another child beneath it, not her own. In summer, people lived apart, divided by envy or fatigue, but in the cold they became closer, drawn together by necessity, yes, but also by something gentler, something wordless. They understood that warmth, once shared, multiplied. One winter, in a small northern village, it was said that the poorest family left their door unlatched every night. Anyone passing by, even a stranger, could come in and sit by their fading fire for a while. No one ever took more than the warmth, and no one stayed too long. It became an unspoken custom, one that lasted for years. The villagers said that in the morning, the fire always burned a little longer than expected, as though the act of kindness itself had added fuel to it. No one could explain it, but the story spread far and wide, and people began to repeat it in other towns. A door left open on a frozen night became a kind of prayer. There were smaller acts too, easily overlooked. The baker who left his oven door ajar so that the night workers could warm their hands. The widow who shared her lamp oil with her neighbour when his flame went out. The children who gathered bits of straw to make a sleeping nest for stray animals beneath the stable eaves. Each gesture was small, but in the dead of winter, small things meant survival. The cold, in its strange way, encouraged generosity. It made people aware of how fragile life truly was, and how dependent each breath was upon another. Even nature seemed to show its own quiet compassion. Snow, though cold, covered the world gently, softening the harshness of stone and dirt. It buried ugliness and filth beneath a blanket of calm white, giving even the poorest places an air of peace. When the wind paused and the world lay perfectly still beneath the snow, it was as if the earth itself were sleeping. For those who listened carefully, this silence carried a strange comfort. It reminded them that rest, even for the weary, was part of the cycle too. But there was another kind of kindness in the cold, one that was harder to speak of. It was the kindness of release. In the harshest winters, when food ran out and strength waned, death often came softly, without struggle. People said that the cold could numb pain, that it lulled the body into a dream before taking it away. Old stories whispered that those who froze in their sleep did not suffer. They simply drifted off, seeing the white of snow become the white of light. It was a morbid thought, but also in its way, a merciful one. The poor, who had seen too many winters, did not fear it as much as others did. They saw in it a kind of quiet closing, a gentleness that the living world often denied them. Sometimes, when the snow fell thick and silent, the poor would say it was the sky showing pity, hiding their misery under beauty. The flakes covered everything equally, the broken roofs, the cracked walls, the bare trees. It made no distinctions, and for a few hours, before footprints disturbed it, the world seemed pure again. Children, even hungry ones, laughed when the snow came. They forgot, for a moment, that it meant more cold, more hardship. To them, it was magic, tiny, weightless pieces of heaven falling just for them. Watching them play, even the elders smiled. That, too, was the cold's kindness, to give moments of wonder where there should have been none. There was an old belief in some regions that if you listened closely during a snowfall, you could hear it speak. Not like a voice, exactly, but like a faint, sighing, a sound too soft for language. It was said to be the whisper of the world, reminding people to rest, to be still. Those who spent their nights alone found comfort in that. They would sit by their dim fires, listening to the muffled air, and imagine that the snow was speaking to them personally, telling them they had done enough, that it was all right to stop trying so hard for a while. Whether or not the sound was real didn't matter. In the long silence of winter, it felt real enough. The kindness of the cold was subtle, hidden beneath its cruelty. It taught people how to endure, but it also taught them how to see. In the stripped-down simplicity of winter, they discovered the small mercies of life. A spark, a whisper, a shared blanket, a hand extended. The poor, who lived closest to the edge, understood that kindness was not the opposite of hardship, but something that bloomed quietly within it. They knew that warmth meant nothing if not shared, and silence meant nothing if not filled with gentleness. When spring finally came, melting away the last traces of frost, the people missed that peculiar stillness. They missed the way the cold made every breath feel meaningful, every sound deliberate. The world grew noisy again, cluttered with chores and voices, but in their hearts, they carried the calm of the winter, the memory of how even in the harshest season, life had found a way to be kind. And so, when the first flakes of next winter appeared, drifting slowly through the air, there was no fear, only a quiet recognition that the cold was not just an ending, but a companion returning for a time. It would test them again, strip them bare again, and in doing so, remind them once more of everything gentle and good that still lived quietly inside the human heart. There were winters in history that did not know when to end. The world would wait for spring, as it always had, but the buds never came. The soil stayed hard and lifeless. The rivers remained trapped under glass, and the poor, those who already had so little, found themselves facing a season that simply refused to move on. In these endless winters, time seemed to freeze alongside the earth. Days bled into one another, indistinguishable and grey, and even hope felt sluggish, as though it too had grown numb from the cold. For those who lived through such seasons, survival became an act of quiet defiance. In villages across northern Europe during what we now call the Little Ice Age, entire harvests failed, year after year. The sun would rise, but its light had no warmth. Frost would appear in June, as though mocking the very idea of summer. Birds migrated and never came back. It wasn't just the weather that froze, it was the rhythm of life itself. People began to whisper that perhaps the world was ending, that God had turned away. Others said the earth had fallen asleep, trapped in a slumber no fire could wake. The poor suffered most, as they always did. Fields that once fed them turned barren, and even the weeds refused to grow. Livestock died in their pens, unable to find grass beneath the ice. The poor scavenged what they could bark, peeled from trees, roots dug out from frozen soil. the leathery hides of animals boiled until soft enough to chew. Some believed that winter spirits had cursed them, and offerings were left in the snow, pieces of bread, a lock of hair, or the last few coins in a family's keeping. These gestures, however small, gave shape to their desperation. It was easier to believe the cold had a reason, even a cruel one, than to think it was simply indifferent. Yet, amid this desolation, strange stories began to circulate. Tales of certain families who survived while others vanished. It was said that they had learned to read the cold, to sense the hidden movements beneath it. They claimed that the snow spoke if one listened long enough, that its silence was not empty but alive. According to these whispers, some could tell when the frost would harden or when the ice on the river would crack, simply by the faint pitch of the wind through the trees. Whether true or not, these beliefs gave people something to hold on to, an illusion of control in a world that offered none. And then there was the sky. During those endless winters, it changed in ways that frightened even the elders. The colours at dusk deepened unnaturally, burning red as though the heavens themselves were aflame. Some called it a warning. Others saw beauty in it, a kind of mournful grandeur that reminded them that life, even in its bleakest form, still had a pulse. It's said that children would stand for hours in the snow, staring at the horizon until their eyelashes froze, waiting to see if the sky might shift again or if it might drop some message they could not yet understand. In towns that had known prosperity, roofs caved under the weight of snow left unshoveled. Streets grew silent except for the faint groan of timber and the soft thud of snow slipping from eaves. The sound of footsteps became rare. The bells of churches, when they rang, seemed duller, their tones absorbed by the thick air. Inside, families huddled together, not out of affection but necessity. Each body was a source of warmth, a fragile defense against the chill that crept in through every crack. Even the smallest flame became precious. It was not unusual for a candle to be guarded more fiercely than bread. The hunger of that era was unlike anything known before. When food could no longer be traded, people turned to barter what little they had left. A pair of boots for a loaf of bread, a copper ring for a pot of frozen beans. There were even quiet markets that met under the moonlight, where desperate villagers would exchange things too shameful to speak of: memories, heirlooms, sometimes even the promise of labour long after the thaw. Those who traded there often did so without words, communicating only through glances and gestures. The cold made speech painful, lips cracked, and voices carried too easily in the still night. It's hard to imagine the silence of those winters. Modern minds cannot grasp what it means for sound itself to seem frozen. No birds, no running water, no rustle of leaves, only the crunch of snow underfoot and the low breath of the wind through hollow branches. In such quiet, people began to hear other things, small noises that had always been there but went unnoticed. The creak of bones settling in sleep, the slow tick of ice forming along a wall, the faint heartbeat of someone lying beside them, fading into the rhythm of the night. There is a kind of intimacy in that silence, though it is not a comforting one. It is the intimacy of knowing how small one truly is. And yet, curiously, many of those who lived through these winters described feeling a strange peace. Perhaps it was the surrender that came when every effort to resist had failed. Or perhaps it was the realization that the cold had a kind of order to it, something steady and predictable in a world that was otherwise falling apart. They began to see patterns in frost, faces in snowdrifts, shapes in the frozen panes of glass. These weren't hallucinations in the modern sense, but rather the mind's quiet way of surviving, finding stories where there was nothing else to hold on to. The strangest of these patterns were called winter's marks. They appeared on windows and walls as the frost thickened, twisting into shapes that resembled eyes, branches, or even the outlines of sleeping figures. Some villagers believed these marks were warnings, omens that told who would survive until spring. Others claimed they were messages from the dead, carried on the breath of the season itself. A few people even recorded seeing faces they recognized: parents, long buried, children lost to fever, etched faintly in the frost before fading away by dawn. Whether real or imagined, these visions became part of the season's folklore, whispered about by those too weary to hope, yet too stubborn to stop believing. And so, life went on, day by frozen day. The poor found ways to persist, wrapping their feet in cloth, drinking melted snow, burning whatever could catch flame. The cold became both enemy and companion, its presence constant and inescapable. In time, some began to treat it with respect, almost reverence, as though it were a god of its own making. They would step outside at dusk, bow their heads, and breathe a few words into the icy air, just in case the frost was listening. There was no asking for mercy, only acknowledgement. When spring finally did come, it arrived like a ghost unsure of its welcome. The snow receded, but not all at once. Patches of green began to show through the grey, tentative and thin. The rivers stirred, coughing up the ice that had held them prisoner. Yet the people who emerged from those winters were changed, their movements slower, their voices softer. It said they no longer trusted warmth entirely, that even on sunny days they would glance at the horizon, half expecting the snow to return. In some ways, the winter that refused to end never truly left them. It lingered in their habits, in their prayers, in the quiet way they looked at the world. The memory of hunger, of cold, of silence, it all became a kind of inheritance, passed down not through words but through the tone of a sigh, the careful saving of crumbs, the instinct to light a fire even when the air is palled. Still warm, perhaps that is the truest mark left by those endless winters, not the frost that melted or the crops that failed, but the way people learned to live after it was over. Always a little cautious, always watching the sky, waiting, just in case, for spring to change its mind again. When the cold finally loosened its grip, the world did not roar back to life, it sighed. The thaw came quietly, like a hand resting on a fevered brow. Snow retreated into the cracks of the earth, and the sound of dripping water returned after what felt like an eternity. To those who had survived, it was not a season of celebration but of disbelief. The cold had been there for so long that warmth felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as though it might vanish if acknowledged too loudly. People stepped out from their huts and shelters slowly, shielding their eyes from a sun they no longer trusted. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and thawing soil. For weeks, they had measured life by the sound of wind and the whisper of frost. Now there was birdsong again, hesitant and distant, like a memory testing its strength. The rivers began to murmur. The trees creaked as they stretched. Everything seemed to wake at once, yet nothing dared move too quickly. In those early days of warmth, the poor found themselves relearning simple things: how to walk without fear of slipping, how to sleep without layers of wool or damp straw pressing against their skin. The hearths that had burned ceaselessly through the winter grew cold, not because they lacked wood, but because people began to crave the sound of silence without fire's crackle. It was strange to miss the thing that had nearly killed them, but that is how memory works. It reshapes suffering into something familiar, even comforting. The survivors carried an invisible warmth within them, one that no sun could provide. It was not a warmth of the body, but of the spirit, a quiet endurance forged through endless nights of cold. Even years later, when the seasons turned and summers grew long again, they would sit near their doorways at dusk, feeling the air cool against their skin, and remember how they once prayed for this very softness. That memory became its own kind of fire, gentle, internal, steady. But something peculiar happened in the generations that followed. The descendants of those who survived the endless winters developed small habits that puzzled outsiders. In some villages, People would hang a single piece of blackened wood above their doors, said to have been part of the last fires of their ancestors. In others, families would light a candle on the coldest night of the year and let it burn until dawn, not for warmth, but for remembrance. They called it times the keeping of the flame, asterisk, and though no one could quite explain why, they believed that without it, the cold would someday return stronger than before. There are records from the 18th century of travellers passing through rural towns and finding curious rituals around the first thaw. In one account, a man describes villagers gathering near a half-frozen stream, lowering their hands into the icy water and then pressing them to their heart. They said it was to remind themselves that warmth and cold belong together, that one without the other would make the world unbalanced. There's something deeply human in that thought. The way pain and comfort become inseparable in memory. Somewhere along the way, the poor who had once struggled simply to live became the quiet keepers of a deeper wisdom. That survival was not just the act of staying alive, but the art of remembering how fragile life truly is. When they told stories to their children, they didn't speak of kings or wars, but of fires that burned too dimly, of shoes made from rags, of nights when the wind itself seemed alive. They taught them that warmth should never be taken for granted, that every flame, no matter how small, carries the ghost of those who once needed it most. Even today, in the ruins of old villages where time has erased much, archaeologists sometimes find small circular hearths, too small for cooking, too deliberate to be accidental. In one of them, beneath layers of soot, was found a fragment of clay shaped like a heart, cracked by heat but still intact. No one knows who made it. Perhaps it was a child playing near the embers, or perhaps it was someone marking the moment they first felt warmth again after a lifetime of cold. Either way, it stands as a message from the past, a reminder that even when the cold takes everything, the instinct to hold on to warmth never dies. The idea of warmth became more than a sensation, it became a philosophy. Farmers began to store not only grain but the embers of their hearths, sealing them in clay pots to relight their fires after long absences. Sailors carried small bundles of charred wood from their homes when they travelled, believing that carrying the memory of warmth would protect them at sea. And in churches, some priests began to speak of the inner fire, not as a metaphor for faith, but as a real, shared inheritance of those who had endured winters that wanted to erase them. The strangest tales, though, are those whispered by wanderers who claim that sometimes, on nights when frost covers the windows just so, you can still feel a faint warmth against your back, as though someone unseen is standing nearby, shielding you from the cold. It isn't frightening, it's gentle, comforting even. Some say it's the warmth of those who never survived the winter, still lingering among the living, ensuring that no one else will feel the same freezing loneliness they once did. Whether true or imagined, the thought itself is enough to make one breathe a little slower, to listen a little more carefully to the silence that fills a cold night. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the poor who endured those harshest winters, not just the proof that life can persist through suffering, but the quiet lesson that warmth, once earned, can never entirely vanish. It becomes part of us, woven into our stories, our gestures, our fears. We might live in heated homes now, surrounded by light and comfort, but some part of our nature still remembers the darkness. We still light candles when the power fails. We still gather close to one another when storms roll in. We still tell stories by firelight, as if afraid that silence might grow too heavy again. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of those old winters in the way people move through cold mornings, how they pull their coats tighter, how they pause to watch their breath in the air, how they smile when they step back into warmth. It's a small, wordless ritual, passed down through centuries, proof that the memory of cold and the gratitude for warmth are both ancient companions we still carry. The cold that once defined their suffering eventually became the backdrop for their greatest gift, resilience. And the warmth they found, whether in the glow of fire, the closeness of others, or the slow return of spring, became something more permanent. Not just heat, but meaning. A reminder that even the harshest seasons end, and what remains after is not merely survival, but a quiet form of grace. And so, the story of those winters closes not with despair, but with stillness. Somewhere, deep in the past, a mother draws her child closer as the snow begins to melt. A man stirs the ashes of a fire that has burned all night and finds, at the very center, one coal still glowing, faintly red. He smiles not because he is warm, but because he knows that he soon will be. That glow, that fragile ember, has traveled through time in ways we cannot see. It lives in us now in the comfort of our rooms, in the light that softens our walls, in the small moments when we feel safe without quite knowing why. The poor who survived the harshest winters left behind no monuments, no gold, no written history, but they left us warmth, the kind that lingers quietly long after the fire has gone out. So if you ever find yourself listening to the wind on a cold night, remember them, and remember that the warmth you feel, even now, was once fought for in silence against the unrelenting frost. It is a borrowed gift, carried across generations, kept alive by those who refuse to let it die. And with that thought, let the fire in your mind grow soft. Let your breath slow. The world outside can wait. You have warmth enough for tonight. Good night.